بسم الله والصلاة والسلام على Rasulullah. Today we're going to talk about the Plague of Amwas, or it's also known as Amwas, and the conquests of the peripheries, meaning namely Egypt and Khorasan. This is the fifth lecture in our series. أهلا وسهلا السلام عليكم يا طلاب العلم. So this is a medieval European painting of the plague that occurred in I believe it was the 14th or 15th century. And I just want you to kind of focus on the imagery here and how bleak people saw life or society. There's weapons on the ground. People were fighting. There's these skeletized bodies. There's death everywhere. People look desperate. They're yelling and shouting. They got their arms in the air. Even the horses look like they're starving. People don't have clothes. Everything is tough and chaotic and difficult. And this is what plagues did. Currently, right now, we're in the times of COVID-19. I don't have to tell you that. Inflation is a major problem right now in the United States, and I imagine all across the world. There's warfare going on around the world. Resources are scarce. People here in America are struggling big time, I know, because besides this job, I work at an Islamic nonprofit called El Ma'un, the Neighborly Needs, where we give assistance directly to the community, like rental assistance, utilities assistance, halal meals on wheels, job training and placement. We work predominantly with the African American community. We have a halfway house for those coming out of prison. All of our services are geared towards the formerly incarcerated. We try our best to make homeless packages, give out free diapers, free winter jackets, all that kind of stuff. So anyways, I say all that to say I deal directly with the people. And I know the economic ramifications of COVID-19 firsthand, of what a plague can do. And that's evinced very strongly in this painting here. So I thought it would be good to show this painting here, just to kind of give you an idea of how demoralizing and catastrophic and chaotic all of that is. I know we're living through it right now, but in the medieval era, I think, it hit people and hit things much harder than it does now. And I hope the glasses aren't too distracting. They're just meant to block out the blue light from the computer screen. So, what is the bubonic plague? It's in Arabic, they call it a ta'un, a ta'un with a ta, very thick ta. A ta'un is the Arabic word for plague. The etymology of the word is kind of unknown. Why is there these two long vowels in it? Ta'na means kind of to stab or to slander in Arabic. So I guess Ta'un is kind of like the exaggerated stab or death, or I don't know how you want to conceptualize that, but that's about as much as I know with the history of that particular word. It could be very possible that Arabic borrowed that word from another Semitic language or Near Eastern language. As we will see throughout the lecture today, Arabic was in constant contact with other languages in the Near East. Um, One can simply read about the Hittites, who were an Indo-European group that occupied northern Mesopotamia, or what you might say, Anatolia and northern Syria, Haran, those types of areas. They were called the Hittites, and they spoke an Indo-European language. The word that they used for water was Wasser, which is the same as German. Um, and Greek eventually kind of replaced the Hittite language for Anatolia. All of Anatolia was Greek speaking. Many of the Ghassanid Arabs could speak Greek. Even the ancient Nabateans, many of them could speak Syriac and Greek besides Arabic. And as we mentioned a little bit before with the Lakhmids and El Hira, they spoke Persian oftentimes. They were trained in the Persian language. Persian itself, Pahlavi, Middle Persian, and contemporary Farsi, it's Indo-European, much like what the Hittites spoke. It's closer to Greek than any Semitic language. So, to be a good historian of the early Islamic period, some knowledge of Latin, Greek, Persian comes in handy. Syriac, Hebrew. So if you ever think seriously about getting into these things, or you happen to know any of these languages, they can be beneficial. So let's get into it. So the image here, right here, is of an infected flea. This is a flea that is infected. This black portion is its gut, infected with the bacterium Yersinia pestis. And this is the bacteria under a, what do they call that, like a microscope or whatever. And so this is it. And I'm going to read all this and kind of give some commentary here. So Yersinia pestis is the scientific name for the bubonic plague, also known as the Black Death. Its closest relative is the gastrointestinal pathogen, Yersinia pseudotuberculosis, and more distantly, Yersinia enterocolitica, or colitica. And so basically, it started out as a harmless and normal common bacterium that is found in the gut, that is the intestines of mammals. And those cousins of it probably exist in every single one of us, and me, and in you, and other animals as well. And in 2010, researchers in Germany definitively established, using PCR evidence from samples obtained from Black Death victims, that Y. pestis was the cause of the medieval Black Death, the one that was portrayed in the painting in the previous slide. So they've done DNA testing on these things. They can dig up victims from the era and find DNA still of Yersinia pestis and sequence it, just like they can do with victims of the Spanish flu in the early 20th century. So in 535, this is detailed in that book Catastrophe that you're supposed to read for your reading response. In 535, a massive volcanic eruption in Indonesia, an eruption so large that Sumatra and Java, once a single island, were blown apart, spewing tons of ash into Earth's atmosphere and decreased the world temperature, causing the emergence of the plague in Ethiopia in 540. Which traveled up the Nile to Alexandria, and from there the rest of the Mediterranean. 25 million lives were lost to the plague during Justinian's reign, which was 527 to 565 over Byzantium. So there was this huge volcanic eruption in Indonesia, and it spewed so much ash into the atmosphere that it blotted out the sun. And this is reported by many ancient cultures, including Chinese culture and various European historians. So, I mean, this is something that was just kind of well reported all over the world. And things got really crazy during this time period because there was such a sudden and dramatic climate change. Things all of a sudden got really cold. A lot of crops didn't do very well because they weren't getting proper sunlight because the sky was blotted out in ash. And remember, with the dinosaurs, it was a asteroid that caused so much ash to go into the atmosphere that it killed much of the life on Earth, so they say. And the theory here is similar. There was a bunch of ash spewed into the atmosphere that blocked out sunlight. So things got really rough. Not only did it get cold, but plants were not thriving. And when you get a bunch of ash in the air, it messes up with precipitation, can cause weird things like acid rain or different types of precipitation, but usually an increase in precipitation. They know the temperature dropped because of tree ring analysis during that time period. The trees just didn't grow very well. And so fleas are a really interesting animal, and it makes sense that the plague would pick the flea as a host because it has the ability to pierce the skin of its host. It's got these two kind of needle-like things there that can pierce the skin. And so it could transmit the bacterium into a mammal host. And in colder temperatures, the bacterium coagulates the foregut of the flea, which, coagulate means like it thickens up, and it makes it so that the flea can't actually really eat. So it starves the flea. And so it goes crazy trying to bite every mammal and suck blood, but the blood can't actually go down into the gut. So it's just biting things like crazy, and it's actually starving to death. But every time that it, would bite something, if it gets its mouth darts like embedded deep in the skin, and it kind of, there's this warmness that's sensed from the body temperature of that mammal. The flea will then regurgitate while it's sucking the blood of that mammal. It will like regurgitate all of the contents of its stomach, which infects that animal, usually a rat, with the bacterium, and it would spread the plague that way. So rats, their population explodes in cooler temperatures when there's more precipitation, as was the case in the 530s, a common era. And then during warmer temperatures above 75 degrees Fahrenheit, the bacterium cannot coagulate the foregut of the flea. So the flea doesn't have this starving moment where it wants to bite everything. So, in other words, the plague wouldn't spread very well. And also, when there's higher temperature and more sunlight, your body has more vitamin D, and you're more easily able to fight off infection. And so, because of this volcanic eruption in Indonesia that impacted the whole world, temperatures went down, precipitation went up, rat populations exploded all over the world. So the rats were eating all the grains that humans had stored, yet at the same time the crops weren't doing well, so food was running out rapidly. It caused mass starvation and famine. And the disease in humans would then infect the bloodstream, after either a human got bit by a flea or exposed to a contaminated rat or what have you. Maybe the the rat eating the human food, the grains, and then the humans eating that grains would infect the human. Basically, it would infect the bloodstream of the human and attack the lymph nodes, causing pustules or cysts to form all over the body. And the Greek word for these cysts were bubos, and that's where the term bubonic plague comes from. Is the fact that you get these buboes all over your body. So after infiltrating the lymphatic system, Yersinia Pestis would infect the lungs and it would turn into a pneumonia. So COVID-19 is a pneumonia. It causes all this mucus to build up in the lungs. And when it turns into a pneumonia, it becomes airborne because people are then breathing the bacterium out through their respiratory system. And so the bacteria becomes airborne, and then it infects many more humans. And it was a long and painful death, on average lasting 23 to 48 days, where you'd have these extremely painful cysts. They would explode. They would cause all kinds of pain and pus and nastiness and grossness. They would stink. A long and painful death. In Constantinople, which was the capital of Byzantium, many people would go mad, go crazy from the painful buboes. It was so painful that they would just go drown themselves, throw themselves in the sea to end their suffering. And so they would jump off, like the edge of the fortress and throw themselves into the water and drown themselves because they couldn't stand the pain any longer. And one estimate had as much as 244,000 residents of Constantinople having died from the plague out of a total population of 508,000. So that's like half of the population, basically. And they had implemented in Constantinople a full shutdown, like a lockdown, like we had in the beginning of COVID-19 in 2020. People weren't supposed to leave their houses except for absolute bare necessities. And those who didn't die directly from contracting the bubonic plague died due to starvation because the crops didn't do well. A lot of the bakers and harvesters died. The rat population exploded and ate up all the human food that was in storage. When the rats would defecate infected feces onto human food, humans would get infected with the plague through eating that food, and it would contaminate the food, like cause other types of bacteria and mold and weird things to grow. So the food dried up really quick. A lot of people died from starvation, and a lot of people were starving and then contracted the plague and didn't have the bodily resources, the calories, to fight the plague. So it just caused all kinds of mass death. And this was during the time of the Prophet ﷺ's grandfather, who crushed up bread for the pilgrims, Hashemah. That's where you get the tribal name or clan name, Banu Hashim. That was a branch of the Quraysh. And so there are some Orientalists that theorize actually the plague came to Arabia, but it had a very small impact there because the climate of Arabia, it's too hot for the plague to spread very good. It's a low population. People are nomadic, live kind of far away from each other. It just doesn't spread very well. But what it did cause in Arabia that is well documented is a huge famine, because all over the world, whether there was plague or not, temperatures did drop, the sun was blotted out by ash, and crops did not grow. And so when you think about the Prophet's grandfather, peace be upon him, who was crushing up the bread for pilgrims, it takes on a much higher significance when you know about what was going on during that time period. Because there was multiple eruptions of the plague. that happened all throughout the 6th century. There's outbreaks of it that lasted all the way up till the year 600. And it spread to the Persians, we know. They actually contracted it from physical warfare with the Byzantines. So in the book Catastrophe that you're supposed to read for your reading response, he has this theory that when you look at Surat al-Fil, about the elephant marching, under King Abraha to go destroy the Kaaba, that Tayran Ababil, that these birds that are mentioned in the surah, that it's a metaphor, he thinks, for the plague. He in Gaz is the language of ancient Ethiopia or Abyssinia, Al-Habasha. In their language, in what do you call it, epigraphs or inscriptions, it's documented that there was a plague that broke out during the time of Abraha. So he theorizes, the author of Catastrophe, David Keyes, if I remember correctly, David Keyes theorizes that Abraha's army contracted the plague, which made them turn around and leave Mecca. And so he thinks that surah, with the stones being thrown down by the birds, is a metaphor for the buboes that appeared on all the enemy soldiers, all of Abraha's soldiers' body. And that's the only way the Arabs knew how to understand it, or could describe it to one another, because they didn't have a word for bubo. That's a Greek word. They didn't, these types of diseases were not common in Arabia. They didn't know how to conceptualize them. They didn't maybe have a word for cyst or pustule. But they knew that these things look like ahjar. They look like rocks. So, Allahu a'lam bis-sawab with these types of things. It's speculation. But it's just an interesting thing to think about. Could very well be that it was the physical miracle of stones being thrown at Abraha's army, and at the same time they got the plague. Allahu a'lam, it's not that important really to understanding Islamic history, that specific thing, but it's important to know that the plague was a factor in all of this. And it was I guess you could say, plague and starvation, famine was a major development during the 6th century. Is important to understanding Islamic history, because most of the seerah, all that kind of stuff, it happens in this early 7th century, in the early 600s. And so right after this massive famine and plague is the time of the Prophet, peace be upon him. He was born in the year of the elephant, Am el-Fil. And so all these events are kind of crucial to understand. And unfortunately, the Ta'un, or bubonic plague, is not very highlighted in the traditional seerah sources, which modern seerahs, they need to add this, in my opinion, this fact into like the introduction or what have you. Tabari is pretty good about mentioning it, and those different types of historians like Al-Mas'udi and Ibn Khaldun and the likes. But it's often not, the Arabs don't talk about it much, because I don't think they really understood what it was or what they were dealing with enough for them to describe it, in detail. And so the Plague of Amwas, or Amwas, and so Amos, or Amos in Greek and Hebrew, likely means that the original Arabic pronunciation was Amwas, but you do see it in manuscripts of Tabari as both Amwas and Amawas, like they actually write the Fatha over the meme. So Allahu A'lam what the real name of it's really supposed to be. but I'm going to refer to it as Amwas because the Greek and Hebrew words would indicate as such. And so this was according to most narrators, in the year 18 Hijri, which would be 639 in the Gregorian system. A great plague fell upon the Levant, the plague of Amwas, which led to a tremendous loss of life amongst the Muslims. And it would spread to Iraq, Egypt, eventually all of Arabia, including places like Basra. It caused a major famine during Umar's reign, and that's why I had you read that hadith about suspending the punishment for theft, because people were starving. And if when you read Adam Sabra's account, it's well known, very well known in Islamic history, that Umar bin al-Khattab radiyallahu ta'ala anhum, he suspended not only the punishment for theft, but he also fixed market prices for things like bread, flour, both like sha'ir, wal-hinta, how do you say that in English? Barley, and hinta was like a very ancient form of wheat. I forget the English name for it, but it was a very ancient form of wheat. All those types of things, Umar bin al-Khattab, he fixed the price for them. So fixing the market price, or controlling the market, the state controlling the market, does have precedence in Islam. So that's important to think, about. Islamic economics is not capitalism. It's not socialism either. It's its own thing. And so it's thought that 25,000 Muslims would die in this plague, many of them Sahaba, many of them Tabi'een. And it would cause the army of Abu Ubaidah bin al-Jarrah to stop its advance towards Constantinople. Abu Ubaidah was settled in Palestine at the time, like we know from the previous lecture. And I'm talking about the greater Palestine, not the region Philistine. And Abu Ubaidah said, "O God, grant the family of Abu Ubaidah their share of this plague." Then a small sore appeared on his pinky finger, which he thought might be a bubo. So then Abu Ubaidah said, "I wish that God blesses it, because when he blesses something little, it becomes a lot." But why would Abu Ubaidah wish that he had the plague? That doesn't make sense. Why would he wish that? And to give you the spoiler alert, because if you die in a plague, you die as what? As a martyr, shaheed. So many of those people who did succumb to COVID-19, inshallah, Allah accepts them as shuhada, as martyrs. When I visited, I had the blessing, alhamdulillah, the opportunity to go to Tempe, Arizona for an Islamic seminar there. And this was recent. This was in January of 2022. I stayed there for approximately 5 days. Every single day that I was there, they had a janazah prayer at the masjid. People dying from COVID-19. Inshallah, Allah accepts them as shuhada. And so Umar was informed of the plague, Amwas, and he grew concerned for Abu Ubaidah's life. And he wrote urgently to Abu Ubaidah, "Assalamu alaikum. I have a problem and I need you here in Medina to solve it. It is urgent and cannot be resolved without you. I command that if this message reaches you at any time, night or day, that you ride to me immediately. Abu Ubaida's troops had become afflicted with the disease as well. He was certain that death was near. He recalled the advice of the Prophet ﷺ, if you hear of a plague, ta'un, affecting a region, do not enter it. If the plague spreads in the region in which you reside, do not leave the region to escape and spread the plague further. Abu Ubaidah wrote back to his friend and brother in Islam, Assalamu alaikum ya Amirul Mu'mineen. I am but one of the Muslim soldiers. I cannot leave them behind to save my life. I also know that you need me, that your need for me was your wish to save someone who is not eternal nor long in this world. When my message reaches you, I implore you to relieve me of your request and grant me permission to stay. Umar read the letter with great sadness, weeping greatly. Umar bin al-Khattab, for as much of a tough guy, or you might say Jalali, as he wasn't afraid to cry. And, this whole thing we have in American culture where machismo is conflated with no emotion is not from Islam. And so Umar was certain that Abu Ubaidah's fate was sealed. As Umar feared, Abu Ubaidah soon fell ill, stricken with the plague, so probably the thing on his pinky was a bubo, even though that's not really, buboes they tend to appear where the lymph nodes are, but Allahu A'lam. So he was ill with the plague, along with thousands of his soldiers. In his final days, he gathered his troops and gave them heartfelt advice. Were any person to live 1,000 years, there is no doubt that he would still befall the fate that you see before you. Death has been ordained upon all the children of Adam. So the intelligent focuses on obedience to Allah, ubudiyah, and virtuous acts, fada'il al-a'mal. Extend my greeting to the Caliph. Let him know there was not a single task assigned to me that I did not fulfill as well as possible. Peace and blessings upon you all. Mu'adh, lead your fellow Muslims in prayer. That's Mu'adh bin Jabal. In his waning moments, he ordered that the Muslims be confined to their homes to stop the spread of the plague. Abu Ubaidah then uttered the words of the Prophet ﷺ, death at the hands of a plague is like martyrdom for the Muslim, meaning that he, like so many of his comrades who died in battle, would attain the rank of martyrs. And with that, Abu Ubaidah radiyallahu ta'ala anhu passed away. And I'm going to read a little bit from At-Tabari about the plague of Amwas. According to Ibn Humayd, Salama, then Ibn Ishaq, the year 18639 began in which the plague of Amwas broke out. One after the other, the people perished in it. Also, Abu Ubaidah bin al-Jarrah died. The supreme commander of Syria, as well as Mu'adh bin Jabal, Yazid bin Abi Sufyan, Al-Harith bin Hisham, Suhail bin Amr, Utbah bin Suhail, and many more noble people, Nubala. According to Ahmed bin Thabit, then Ishaq bin Isa, then Abu Ma'shar, the plague of Amwas and Al-Jabiyah was in the year 18639. According to Ibn Humayd, Salama, Muhammad bin Ishaq, Shu'bab bin al-Hajjaj, Al-Mukharij bin Abdullah al-Bajili, Tariq bin Shihab al-Bajili. We went to Abu Musa al-Ash'ari, who was in his home in al-Kufa, to talk to him. When we were seated, he said, I am not asking from you that you make light of this matter, For in this house someone succumbed to this disease. But neither do you keep away from this town, leaving for the wide and wholesome open spaces of your land, until this pestilence abates. I shall tell you what ideas are frowned upon, with which one might try to protect oneself in this respect. That someone who does leave town thinks that if he had stayed, he would have died, and that someone who does not leave and does contract the disease thinks that if he had left, he would not have been infected. If the veritable Muslim does not think this, then there is no real need for him to leave town or keep far away from it. I was with Abu Ubaidah bin al-Jarrah in Syria in the year when the Plague of Amwas broke out. So here, Abu Musa al-Ash'ari, he's talking about the Plague of Amwas while a plague in Iraq is happening. So there was multiple outbreaks of the plague. Keep that in mind. When the disease had become widespread and news of that had reached Umar, he wrote to Abu Ubaidah in an attempt at inducing him to leave the contaminated area. And this is the story that I just basically told you. And I'm going to skip ahead here. So according to Ibn Humayd, Salama, Muhammad bin Ishaq, Aban bin Salih, Shahr bin Hawshab al-Ash'ari, someone from his clan who after his father had died was left behind to take care of his mother and an eyewitness of the Plague of Amwas. In other words, Shahr's stepfather. When the disease became widespread, Abu Ubaidah stood up amongst his men and delivered the following speech. Men, this sickness is a mercy from your Lord, a request from your Prophet Muhammad, and it has caused the death of the pious who died before you. I, Abu Ubaidah, ask God that he assign to me my share thereof. Suddenly he suffered an acute attack of the disease, as a result of which he died. Mu'adh bin Jabal was appointed as his successor over the people. Mu'adh bin Jabal led the funeral prayer, the janazah, for Abu Ubaidah, and he himself, succumbed to the disease. And when he had died, Amr bin al-As was made his successor over the people. Amr stood up to address the people and said, Men, when this sickness strikes, it spreads like wildfire. So let us run away from it to the mountains. And it's true, when the bubonic plague struck and it became pneumonic, it spread very rapidly. Then Abu Wathila al-Hudhali said, By God, you are known to us as a liar. While you were still no better than the donkey I sit on, I had already become a companion of the Prophet. But, he went on, by God, this time I will not reject what you say. I swear by God, we should not stay here. Then he departed, and the people went with him and scattered in all directions. Eventually God took the plague away from them, he went on. The news of this opinion of Amr bin al-As reached Umar bin al-Khattab, and by God, he did not raise objections to it. He allowed Amr bin al-As to kind of use his personal ijtihad or discretion to leave and go to a mountainous area or wherever, And so circumstances are different, and this is where fiqh al-waqi', it comes in, where you're taking account the realities in front of you and making a fiqh ruling with that in consideration. According to Ibn Humayd, Salama ibn Ishaq, someone anonymous, Abu Qilaba Abdullah bin Zayd al-Jarmi, so there's someone anonymous in the chain of narration here, so take this story with a grain of salt. From among the words spoken by Abu Ubaidah and Mu'adh bin Jabal, it came to my notice that they said, Verily this sickness constitutes a mercy from your Lord, a request from your Prophet, and it has caused the death of the pious who died before you. At this point I used to say, how can the Messenger of God pray for such a calamity to befall his community? Someone whose veracity I do not suspect even related to me that he had heard it from the Prophet's own mouth, and also that Gabriel once came to the messenger of God and said to him, "The perdition of your community will occur as the result of a spear thrust or the plague." And there's a footnote here, like I mentioned earlier. Both spear thrust and plague are words derived from the same root, ta, ain, nun. The message conveyed seems to be your community will perish as a result of warfare and disease. Then the messenger of God began to intone, "Oh my God, death through the plague." And so I realized that those were the same words spoken by Abu Ubaidah and Mu'adh. According to Ibn Humayd, Salama Muhammad bin Ishaq, when the news of the deaths of Abu Ubaidah and Yazid bin Abi Sufyan finally reached Umar, he put Muawiyah bin Abi Sufyan in charge of the forces in Damascus and its kharaj, meaning the land taxes. So you have this famous book, Kitab al-Kharaj, written by Abu Yusuf, student of Abu Hanifa, and then there's a sharh, I believe it's by al-Jassas on that. So it's basically land taxes. Where, like in feudal Europe, you would have peasants who were attached to the land, and a portion of their harvest would be given to the feudal lord, which also was known as the landlord, which is where the modern idea of landlords come from, where we pay rent to the landlords. So this is what the Kharaj tax is. And Shurahbil bin Hasana was in charge of the forces in the region known as Al-Urdun. Remember the map from the last lecture? And its Kharaj. As for Saif, he claims that the Plague of Amwas occurred in the year 17 or 638, so a year earlier. And it could be that both of those datings are correct, because there could have been multiple outbreaks. Just like with COVID-19, each year we're having another outbreak and different variants and things like that. So according to Al-Sari, Shu'aib, Saif, Abu Uthman, Abu Haritha, and Al-Rabi', via their respective isnads, that the plague of Amwas was so devastating that nothing resembling it had ever been seen. The enemy ardently wished the Muslims to succumb to it, the hearts of the latter being filled with terror. The death toll was enormous, and it persisted a long time, so long, the months in fact, that people talked about nothing else. Just like when COVID-19 came 2020, that was the only thing the news talked about 24/7 every day. And all of this has me thinking, had Abu Ubaidah bin al-Jarrah survived the plague, would the Umayyads ever been able to come to power? Because when the plague hit, Abu Ubaidah died, therefore Yazid bin Abi Sufyan, remember Abu Sufyan who fought the Muslims, surrendered with Fath al-Mecca, and became Muslim, then fought alongside the Muslims. Yeah, that's him. That's his son, Yazid. He was appointed as governor, but then he died. And when this news reached Umar put his brother Muawiyah bin Abi Sufyan in charge of the forces in Damascus. Remember, Muawiyah had a son that he named Yazid bin Muawiyah, who was in charge during Karbala and the death of Hussein radiyallahu anhum. So this had huge ramifications. The Plague of Amwas had huge ramifications for Islamic history. Would there have even been an Umayyad dynasty if Abu Ubaidah had remained in charge of Sham? Allahu A'lam. And so that is more or less all what I have to say about the Plague of Amwas. So we're going to talk about Amr bin al-As and how he conquered Egypt. And so this is a picture of me when I lived in Egypt, and I am at Masjid Amr bin al-As, or sometimes called Jami' Jami' or Jami', it refers to a very large mosque. Um, and it is quite large. Very simplistic architecture, no frills to it, as you can see. Um, it looks like, you know, a very classical Islamic building, something you would imagine you would see in Arabia during the 7th century, during the time of the Prophet. So, you know, this may be what the fortress might have looked like, of like Banu Qaynuqa or Banu Nadir, or, you know, what have you, right? Very simple, basic, what buildings would have looked like in Mecca and Medina. And Amr bin al-As, when he built it, it was the first mosque built in Africa. He wanted to pick a place where it wasn't near Qala'a, which is in English a citadel, or like you know, like a someplace up high, like a fortress that's up high. He didn't want it near one of those, and he didn't want it near. He uses the word Husun, which is like fortresses, like Hisn al-Muslim, fortress of the Muslim. So he wanted it more in a civilian area in hope that it will soften the hearts of the Egyptians to get them to convert to Islam. So that was probably my favorite place to go and visit when I lived in Egypt. I didn't go and see any of the pyramids when I was there. That's touristy. It's not what I came there to see. I came there to see all the Islamic historical artifacts, if you will, all the historical places related to Islamic history. And so I went to Masjid Amr bin al-As, you know, numerous times. I loved it there. It's one of my favorite places to go. Has a beautiful courtyard, place to make wudu, and beautiful people that lead the prayer. And so, as we just went over in the last slide, Amr bin al-As, he was part of the conquest of Sham. He was left in charge after Mu'adh bin al-Jabal was taken by the plague, and he then went to Egypt with the permission of Umar bin al-Khattab and conquered not only Fustat, which is now modern day Cairo. They call old Cairo is Fustat. It didn't get the name Cairo or Qahira until after really the Fatimids took it over, or the Ismaili Shia. That's another long story for if you take the history of Islamic polities or Islamic political history. If you take that class, we will go over that history, what's known as the Shi'i century. But yeah, so it was known as Fustat before, and vaguely Egypt was called Misr, which means garrison, or Masr is how they say it in Egypt in dialect. It's a place I have a lot of fond memories about. But in the year 20 Hijri, or that correlates with 640 or 641 Gregorian, Egypt was conquered in that year, and Abu Ma'shar has the same date according to Ahmed bin Thabit and Ishaq bin Isa. Egypt was conquered in the year 641. The Muslim commander was Amr bin al-As, or sometimes Amr bin al-Asi, with a ya at the end after the Sald. And then Alexandria was conquered later in 25 Hijri, or 646. And the main reason that Alexandria was conquered later on, was because you still had a Byzantine general who was stationed there and they could, of course, receive aid, both military and, things like food and whatnot, from Constantinople via the Mediterranean Ocean or Sea. So the famous historian Al-Waqidi, he said it's transmitted to me by Ibn Sa'd, the author Tabaqat Ibn Sa'd, that Misr and Alexandria were conquered in the year 641. According to Saif, according to Al-Sari, Shu'aib, Alexandria was conquered in the year 637. So essentially there's a discrepancy with the dates. There's some khilaf, some difference of opinion about the dates of the events. Frankly, I think the reason why sometimes these type of differences appear is because not only was the same city sacked multiple times or had to be reconquered, but also it's frankly not all that important exactly which year it fell, just knowing which decade a lot of historians were concerned with, or which, general time period. I don't think it has anything to do with like saying that oral transmission is somehow fundamentally flawed and so you get all these differences. I don't think that has anything to do with it. In fact, Ferdinand de Saussure, who's the father of modern linguistics, he has a very famous book, I think it's like Cours du linguistique générale, and in that book he details how actually things that are orally transmitted are often better preserved, more accurately preserved and transmitted than the knowledge transmitted through writing, and it's more corruptible when it's transmitted through writing. And the famous French postmodern philosopher Jacques Derrida, who was from Algeria, Aljazair, he was Jewish and from North Africa, he also made the same argument from a more philosophical lens, that indeed the West has this weird obsession with writing and puts writing over oral traditions for really no good logical reason. And so that's something just to keep in mind as we do history of Islam, that this Orientalist notion that somehow just because it's transmitted orally, it's therefore defunct or something. Anyways, to continue. So when Umar had finished taking measures pertaining to all of Syria, he wrote to Amr bin al-As that he wanted to march upon Egypt with his army. So Amr departed and finally conquered Bab-el-Yun, which some people say refer to Babylon in northern Mesopotamia. Some people say that it was a city within Egypt. So that's also something that people just kind of are a little unsure about. And this is just the task of a historian. We have this text in front of us saying what it says, and it's up to us to try to decipher what in fact that means. And sometimes there might not be a reference that we can find anywhere that lets us know what that means. And so he went on. When he arrived in Belhib, the ruler of Alexandria sent a message to Amr bin al-As that ran, "Listen, you Arabs. In the past, I used to pay the jizya to people who were more hateful to me than you, Persians and Byzantines. If you want me to pay the jizya, I am agreeable on the condition that you will return to me all those people from our region whom you have captured." So the Arabs, when they went into Egypt, they sacked a bunch of small villages, taken people as prisoners of war, and those people were exported, if you will, transported to the Arabian Peninsula, to Iraq, Sham, all those different places. And so the leader of Alexandria that they were speaking with, and it's not sure exactly, who this person quite is, if it's some sort of, usually be like some sort of archbishop or high priest or something. Doesn't say Muqawqis, so I don't think it was Muqawqis, but Allahu A'lam. And so he wanted those prisoners returned to Egypt. The eyewitness went on. Then Amr bin al-As sent that ruler a message that said, "Above me there is a commander, without whose consent I cannot do anything." He's talking about Amr bin al-Khattab, the Caliph. "If you want me to suspend hostilities while you do the same, so that I can write to him about the proposal you have made to me, I shall certainly do that. If he accepts that condition from you, I will too. And if he orders me to do something else, I will carry out his order." So basically he's asking, Umar bin al-Khattab for permission for a ceasefire. The man agreed. He went on. So Umar bin al-As wrote to Umar bin al-Khattab, "Our leaders never kept secret for us the letters they wrote." So in this letter he mentioned to him what the ruler of Alexandria had proposed. All the time the remainder of Egyptian prisoners had been in our care. Then we stopped at Belhib and stayed there waiting for Omar's letter, which finally arrived. Amr read it out to us, and it were the words. And before I read that, it's clear that from Medina, Amr bin al-Khattab was able to communicate quickly and effectively with his various commanders, like we saw with the letter to Abu Ubaidah, deposing Khalid bin al-Walid, radiyallahu anhum, from commandership of the Muslim army, qiyada, if you will. And what my personal belief is that the Arabs had horses. And they had people who were designated as message couriers, that they had the fastest horses bred for speed, and they could fly across the desert faster than anybody else. In the Revolutionary War in America, we had such couriers. And many different wars in many different civilizations used horses for this purpose, because the Orientalists seemed quite skeptical. Why all of a sudden are these traveling so fast in the desert? It doesn't make sense. Well, it was, horses. It's actually not that difficult to figure out. But I digress. So here is the letter from Omar. "Listen, I have received your letter in which you mention that the ruler of Alexandria has proposed to give you the jizya on the condition that you return to him all those prisoners of his region who have been captured. Upon my life, a fixed jizya that comes to us will be coming to those Muslims who live after us is in my view preferable to booty, ghanima, which seems never to have been there once it is divided up. So, you must propose to the ruler of Alexandria that he give you the jizya, in the understanding that those of his people who were taken prisoner and who are still in your care be offered the choice between Islam and the religion of their own people, i.e. Christianity, the Coptic version of Christianity, or Copt in Arabic is Qibt. Should any one of them opt for Islam, then he belongs to the Muslims, with the same privileges and obligations as they. And he who opts for the religion of his own people has to pay the same jizya as will be imposed upon his co-religionists. As for those captives who have been scattered over Arabia and have arrived in Mecca, Medina, or Yemen, those we cannot return, and we would not like to enter into a peace treaty with anyone on the condition of a pledge, which we cannot fulfill for him. Amr sent a message to the ruler of Alexandria, informing him of what the commander of the faithful had written, whereupon his ruler sent a message back that said, "I agree." And that is how Alexandria was surrendered to the Muslims, in a nutshell. Let's see if there's other stuff here. So there's a narration in Tabari where they do talk about Muqawqis and Artabun. Artabun was the Byzantine general who was in Alexandria. So here it says that Muqawqis was in charge of Alexandria. Muqawqis, the word Muqawqis, it comes from the Caucasus Mountains. So Muqawqis was a bishop who was brought by the Romans from the Caucasus regions, north of like Armenia, and made the bishop, or like kind of like the ruler or representative of Rome over Egypt. By Rome I mean Byzantium. And so that's kind of Muqawqis where the term comes from. And like Amwas or Fustat or Muqawqis, you could see that they have more than 3 consonants, which usually signals that this is a word borrowed from a language other than Arabic, from a language that is not a Semitic language. And even though Arabic does have some rare quadrilateral roots, or even some roots where it's 5 letters, like atma'inna. Atma'inna is alif, ta, hamza, nun. Atma'inna, there's a shadda over that last nun. So it's 5 letters, essentially. Those usually signify that the word came from other than a Semitic origin, from other than Arabic. Sometimes when you're able to fully articulate them in different verb forms, that means that it was kind of more integrated into the Arabic language grammatically, but it's still most likely foreign in origin. It's a loan word, a borrowed word from another language that was likely Indo-European or from another language family other than Afro-Asiatic. So just something to keep in mind. So Muqawqis, that name, it's a foreign word, and it refers to the Caucasus Mountains. Same Artabun is also Eretion in Latin. And so they were basically the people in charge of Alexandria. And it says here in Tabari, nothing surprised Amr and al-Zubair more than the sudden attack of Farqab one night. So Farqab, some say that is a nickname of Muqawqis. And some think it might be somebody else. We're not really sure. So he did like a surprise attack on Amr bin al-As, and Az-Zubair was there as well. Zubair bin al-Awam. And fun fact, Abdullah bin Az-Zubair, he tried to establish his own caliphate in defiance of the Umayyads later on. So anything pertinent to Zubair, we have to think of the Zubayrid caliphate that came later. How did events during Zubair's lifetime affect his son Abdullah and his claim to caliphhood? And even though they were surprise attacked by this mystery person of Farqab, Amr bin al-As was prepared. They confronted the Muqawqis, who was killed with his men. So this is another narration in Tabari that counters the other one, where there was somehow a surrendering of Alexandria. So some people say there was a surrendering, some people say that there was this kind of small skirmish, and then just the Muslims just won really quickly. Allahu a'lam bis-sawab. And this is the nature of history. You get conflicting reports, and you kind of have to sift through them, remove the wheat from the chaff, as they say, and try to figure out what really happened, or just be happy with the fact that there could be multiple possibilities, and that's that. That's typically my approach. I don't know which one is more true than the other, and I'm okay with that. They both could have aspects of truth to them. Perhaps this small skirmish happened and then they surrendered on the terms that we mentioned before. Allahu A'lam. And so, according to Al-Sari, Shu'aib, Saif, Abu Haritha, and Abu Uthman, when Amr descended upon the Egyptians at Ain Shams, that's a city in Egypt. Fun fact, Ain Shams University is like the Harvard University of Egypt. It's the top university there. So this is a place that's still prominent in Egypt. So when Amr descended upon the Egyptians at Ain Shams, a place governed jointly by the Copts and Nubians, Az-Zubair had joined Amr there. The people of Misr said to their king, "What do you want to accomplish against warriors who defeated the armies of the Persian king and the Byzantine emperor and overpowered them in their own countries? Conclude a peace treaty with these warriors and enter into a pact with them. Do not resist them and do not order us to resist them." That occurred on the 4th day since the Muslims' arrival, but the king refused. So the Muslims attacked them and fought them. Az-Zubair scaled the wall of the city. When those inside spotted him there, they opened the gate for Amr and rushed out, begging for a peace treaty, to which he agreed. But inside the wall, Az-Zubair fell upon them with force. In the end, he passed through the gate, making his way to Amr together with the Egyptians. After they had taken care of the casualties, they concluded a treaty. The Muslims took the same measures against those who were overpowered by force as they had taken in the case of those who had surrendered on the condition of a treaty. They were all placed under protection. They became Ahlul Dhimma. The text of their peace treaty reads as follows: "In the name of God, the most gracious, the most merciful, the compassionate." This is the text of the covenant that Amr bin al-As has granted the people of Misr concerning immunity for themselves, their religion, their possessions, churches, crucifixes, as well as their land and their waterways. Nothing of these will be interfered with or decreased. Nubians are not allowed to share their homesteads. And this means basically that we're going to protect the Egyptians from Nubian raids. It is incumbent upon the people of Misr, if they agree on the terms of this covenant, and when the rise of the Nile water comes to a halt, to afford the jizya, to wit 50 million dirhams. They will have to account for the crimes committed by robbers from among them. If anyone refuses to comply with the terms of this treaty, jizya obligations will be lifted from them commensurate with their numbers, and we will be exempt from awarding protection to those who do so. If their river fails to reach the highest point when the rise of the water has come to a halt, then commensurate with the losses suffered, their jizya payments will be reduced. So basically it's saying here, like if you don't have as good a harvest as normal, we're not going to expect you to pay the same. So it was like what you might call a sliding scale. Those Byzantines and Nubians who are willing to accept the same terms as in the covenant with the people of Misr will have the same privileges and duties as the latter. He who refuses to accept these terms and chooses to depart will enjoy immunity until he has reached his destination where he can be safe, or has moved out of the territory where our authority prevails. It is incumbent upon them to comply with the following terms. In 3 installments, every third part of the year, they will have to afford 1/3 of what they have to pay. For the terms of this document, the covenant of God and his protection, as well as that of his messenger, that of the Caliph, the commander of the faithful, as well as the protection awarded by all Muslims, are guarantees. It is incumbent upon the Nubians who have accepted the terms of this treaty that they help the local government with many men and so many horses, in the understanding that no raids will be mounted against them, and that they will not be prevented from trade, export, or import. And by Nubians here, they mean the Black Sudanese, or modern-day Sudan as we know it, who had the Nubian civilization. And Sudan, it comes from the word Saudat, or which means black in Arabic, basically. And so Az-Zubair, his sons Abdullah and Muhammad have witnessed the concluding of this covenant. Wardan has put it down into writing and was present. So Abdullah ibn Zubair was present with his father during the conquest of Egypt. Something to remember. And it says here, Amr organized Al-Fustat as a garrison city, whereupon the Muslims took up residence there. Abu Maryam and Abu Miryam presented themselves and spoke to Amr about the prisoners captured after battle, and those presumably are Christian priests. Amr said, "Have these prisoners a pact and a covenant with us? Did we not come to an agreement with you two, and were we not attacked the very same day?" Then he kicked them out, whereupon they returned, saying, "Everyone you have captured up until the time of our return to you will be placed under your protection." Amr replied, "Would you launch an attack against us while they are under our protection?" "Yes," they answered, "we would." Then Amr divided up those prisoners among his men, who distributed them, whereupon they ended up in the lands of the Arabs. So after that, a messenger approached Omar with the same fifth parts of the war booty. Amr sent emissaries to Medina. Omar questioned them, and they gave him a complete account until they touched on the story of the metropolitan, meaning like the high priest, and his companion. Omar said, "Surely I think that they showed sense, whereas you acted foolishly without any sense at all. He who fights you has no immunity, but he who does not fight you and is subsequently dealt with by you in the same way the villagers were treated, does have immunity during those 5 days until they have lapsed." Then he sent messengers in all directions until all those prisoners who had been captured from among those who had not taken up arms during the 5 days were returned, except those who had engaged in fighting afterwards. Thus the Muslims sent those captives back to Egypt, one after the other, except those who belonged to the last category. Meanwhile, some Copts had come to Amr's living quarters. He was informed that they had been saying how worn out these Arabs look, how little they care for themselves. "We are of the opinion that people like us should not be obedient to people like them." So Amr feared that the appearance of the Arab warriors would prompt the Copts to rebellion. Therefore he ordered that several camels be slaughtered and cooked in water and salt. And then he ordered the army of commanders to assemble after they had notified their troops to do likewise. Amr sat down and beckoned to the people of Misr to join him. Then the meat and the broth were served. Servants handed it to the Muslims, who began to eat in a typically Arab fashion, tearing at the meat with their teeth and slurping the broth, dressed in their woolen cloaks and unarmed. After a while, the people of Misr dispersed with their ambitions and courage boosted. So Amr's kind of playing a trick on them. He's, playing on the stereotype that they had of the Arabs. He's making the Arabs look primitive and brutal and, what have you. But then the next day, Amr sent word to the army commanders to come to his tent again with their troops. He ordered them to come dressed in Egyptian cloths and footwear, bidding them that they order their troops to do likewise. They complied. Then Amr invited the people of Misr again, who saw something completely different from what they had seen the previous day. Erect figures, dressed in Egyptian colors, standing by the Arabs, eating Egyptian food, behaving in an Egyptian manner. The Copts dispersed, perturbed this time, muttering, "We have been made fools of." So Amr taught them, don't judge a book by its cover. We embrace both high culture and low culture. We can be both brutal and also sophisticated. Don't judge a book by its cover. And so Omar said famously about Amr, he says, Amr is indeed a crafty fellow. And he installed Amr as governor of Misr, where he stayed. And he built Masjid Amr bin al-As. So, in a nutshell, that's a lot of, you know, what the conquest of Egypt looked like. They did try to go south and conquer Nubia, but they returned having sustained injuries and with many people having been blinded because the Nubians' superior bowmanship. So they were nicknamed the eye shooters because they were so precise with their bow and arrows, with their archery, they'd shoot you just directly in the eye. So the Arabs were not able to penetrate into Nubian lands. And they really weren't able to ever. I mean, they did a little bit. The Ottomans did under the leadership of Muhammad Ali Pasha, but it didn't really go so well either. Yet a lot of them adopted Arabic and eventually became Muslim, but not due to a military presence there per se. And so once the conquest of Egypt was completed, it wasn't over, so to say. They had to station troops north in Alexandria because Heraclius was launching attacks on Egypt and Syria from the sea. So that's something important to know. And during the same year, Umar installed Abu Huraira as governor of Bahrain and Al-Yamama. And then Umar also in the same year organized the Diwans, that is the stipend payment system for the Sahaba. People who were Sahaba that were Badri and Uhudi and these types of things got the most money, and it was like a gradation depending on how many battles with the Prophet you participated in, if you were Muhajirin or Ansar, and so on and so forth. And in the same year, they also sent a dispatch over to Ethiopia. Omar sent Alqama bin Mujazzaz al-Mudlaji overseas to Ethiopia, and the Muslim forces were annihilated by the Ethiopian forces, the Negus' forces, and they never tried to make an attempt of conquering Ethiopia again. But they did try to go into sub-Saharan Africa during this time, and they were repudiated both times. So that's just something interesting to think about. So we're going to talk about the conquest of Khurasan. And so we know already about the Battle of Al-Qadisiyah, which, Sa'ad bin Abi Waqqas, even though he had contracted the bubonic plague, was fighting with Rustum, and Rustum was defeated. They went over to Sestafan, aka El Madain, and they continued on. So from the garrison cities of Basra and Kufa down in this area, they were able to, over more in this area, that's Iraq over there, they blasted through Iran, blasted through Iran and into Khurasan over here. So for the Kufans went more north, the Basrans went more south, and they both ended up in Khurasan. They also got Jurjan up here, and just kind of kept going until eventually they were repudiated by Chinese forces and Turkish forces. They reached Sindh, Pakistan, and I believe it was 711, and the Gregorian date there. And so they got to places like Nisabur or Nishapur, Tuls, which is where Ghazali was from, which is incorporated into modern-day Mashhad. And you have Merv and Balkh and Bukhara, Samarkand, all these places, Ghazni, where the Ghaznavids are from, Herat, all that kind of good stuff. So, I'm going to kind of try to give a small overview of this. And the main reason that the Arabs went that deeply into the Persian Empire was because the Persian emperor, so Khosrow, Kisra, he had actually died, been killed, and it was Yezdegerd who was in charge, and he was fleeing the Muslims. And his idea was he was going to run to the Turks and seek refuge with the Turks. And a lot of Zoroastrians actually went through Sind into modern-day India, and they became part of the community that's known as the Parsi from Pars region in Iran over here. Pars, which is where the word Persian comes from. It became known as Fars, and Farsi is the language, right? But the Parsi people, they went into India, and that's where Freddie Mercury from the band Queen, he's from that community, so he's an old school Zoroastrian, if you will, that left, his lineage, they left Iran and went to India. And so basically, Umar permitted the Muslims to penetrate further into the Persian Empire, leaving Basra and Kufa so that they could capture Yezdegerd. One of the main generals who was in charge, his name was Al-Ahnaf. And so I will try to read you some of the story. And over here, this book here by Patricia Crone, The Nativist Prophets of Early Islamic Iran, Rural Revolt and Local Zoroastrianism, is from Cambridge University Press. It's an interesting book. She details how even after the Muslims had conquered Iran, blasted through it, it only took them 1 year to conquer all of Persia. After they blasted through it and kind of destroyed the empire, or the imperial institutions, if you will, like the military and things, a lot of Zoroastrians ran into the rural mountains where they couldn't easily be reached by Muslim authorities. And from there, they would launch small revolts or rebellions, preserve their Zoroastrian faith, and throughout the centuries, they would still try to fight the Muslims. And every deviant type of sect of Islam, like Ismailis, the assassins, Hashishin, were hiding in those mountains. The Karramiya, these kind of anthropomorphist Mujassimine types, hid out in those mountains. They were famously repudiated by Abdul Qadir Jilani in his chapter on Aqidah in his book Al-Ghunya. Many kind of weird, Khawarij, different groups, they always like to hang out in the mountains of Iran because they were inaccessible to the authorities usually. So in the sense, the flatlands or lowlands of Persia were slim picking, they were easy pickings for the Arabs to blast through and get to Khorasan very quickly. But the mountainous regions, they just overlooked, ignored, and it was always a place that was very difficult to control, the highlands. And so Al-Ahnaf left for Khorasan. He took Mehrajan Qadak and left for Isfahan, while the Kufans were besieging Jay. He entered Khorasan from Tabasan and took Herat by force. He appointed as his deputy there Suhar bin Fulan al-Abdi, then marched on to Marv al-Shahijan. He dispatched to Naysabur, there being no intervening battle. Mutarrif bin Abdullah bin al-Shakhir, and to Sarakhs al-Harith bin al-Hasan. When al-Ahnaf drew near to Marv al-Shahijan, Yezdegerd left it for Marv Arwuth and remained there. So these names, it's a lot of Persian names that are kind of hard to follow, but that's why I just wanted to put a map here on the slide so you could try to follow, where Marv is, where Hirat is, and these types of things. But basically, they're on like a wild goose chase all over the lowlands of Iran, trying to capture Yezdegerd, because they know if they kill him, there's no claim any longer to the Persian throne. And it's much easier then to prevent any later revolts or rebellions from happening amongst the Zoroastrians. So that's what the Muslims were aiming to do by capturing Yezdegerd, either killing him or making him prisoner, or the likes. So Yezdegerd had left for Balkh. So he was staying in Balkh, which is in modern-day Afghanistan. Al-Ahnaf stayed in Marv, and he sent the Kufans to Balkh. Al-Ahnaf followed on after them, and the Kufans and Yezdegerd met in battle in Balkh. And God defeated Yezdegerd, who made for the river at the head of his Persian army and crossed it. Al-Ahnaf joined up with the Kufans when God had already given them victory. So Balkh was one of the victories of the Kufans. The combatants of Khurasan between Nisapur and Tukharistan, and what used to be the territory of the Persian emperor, followed one after the other to make peace, those who had fled and those who had made fortified positions. Al-Ahnaf returned to Marv, where he remained, having made Rib'i bin Amr his deputy in charge of Tukharistan. It is he about whom An-Najashi recited the following, linking his name with his mother, who was a noble Arab. O Minis, the one who is called a young brave, who is not really so. O Rib'i bin Kas, a real young brave, standing tall above them. When those sitting in the yard of his house have taken their fill of what is left in his bowl, he gives them to drink. So this is some praise poetry. Al-Ahnaf wrote to Umar bin al-Khattab of the conquest of Khurasan, and Umar said, I wish I had not sent an army there. I wish there were a sea of fire between us. And this is a reference to the Zoroastrians who worshipped fire. A sea of fire, meaning a whole bunch of, Zoroastrians. And so they would have a flame that they felt they have to keep always lit, permanently lit, always, the flame always going, never burning out. And Ali asked him why he was so distressed by its conquest when it was a joyful occasion. Omar said, yes, but I, and so on until the end of the preceding account. So Umar bin al-Khattab, he, preferred that these people, had stayed Zoroastrian, perhaps, so they could pay jizya. And so they kept chasing around Yezdegerd, and Ahnaf was in charge of 10,000 Basrans. So he represented the Basran leader. The Kufans were there as well, as we know. But the Turks did not receive Yezdegerd very well. They battled with the Muslims on Yezdegerd's behalf and got slaughtered, and they saw that as a bad omen. And they said, we have been here too long, and these men have been killed in a situation such as no one has ever been killed before. There can be no good for us fighting these men. Let us all retire. So the Turkish leaders withdrew. When the day broke, the Muslims could see nothing, and news came to them that the ruler of the Turks had retired to Balkh. So Yezdegerd was in trouble then. And the Persians became skeptical of Yezdegerd. They said, why are you going to the Turks? Why aren't you, trying to rely on Persians to help you out? And so Yezdegerd also pleaded to the Emperor of China for help and wanted the Chinese to intervene Um, but the Persians also didn't really like that. Um, the Chinese had no interest in really helping Yezdegerd. They did not want to fight the Arabs. Um, the Persian polytheists, meaning Zoroastrians, wrote to Al-Ahnaf giving him the news, that this was going on. The Muslims intercepted them, and they got really close to Yezdegerd, but the Persians killed Yezdegerd, and in rebellion, because they were fed up with him, and they stole Yezdegerd's treasures, Athqal, and basically, the people of Khorasan it was kind of chaos. They were fighting the Muslims, sometimes rebelling, revolting, until eventually they killed Yezdegerd. So it was a very kind of chaotic time, but Yezdegerd did get killed, and this was just during the beginning of Uthman's caliphate. But pretty much Khorasan was all captured during Omar's time. But rebellions did happen here and there, like I said, from the mountain areas. If you want to know more about that, you can take a look at Patricia Crone's research into that, because she looked at all the Persian historical sources, seeing their perspective of how they wanted to rebel against the Arabs. And so, for instance, the ruler of China sent a letter to Yezdegerd with the message as follows: I am not prevented from dispatching an army to you stretching from Marv to China by my not knowing what is proper for me. But if these people described to me by your messenger were to try, they could demolish mountains. If nothing were to stand in their way, they could wipe me out, as long as they are described. Like they're the way they are that they're described. Make your peace with them, therefore, and accept some modus vivendi with them. Do not stir them up as long as they do not stir you up. So basically, the Emperor of China is like, don't, just surrender and I'm not getting involved. But, Khorasan was pretty much brought under control, more or less. And Omar gave this address when he was given the news that Khorasan was conquered. God, ever blessed and almighty, has mentioned his apostle and the guidance he sent with him. He promised for anyone following him immediate and future reward, compromising the goodness of this world and the next. He said, He it is who sent his apostle with the guidance and the true religion, that he might make it prevail over any other religion, even though the polytheists were averse. Praise be to God, who has fulfilled his promise and granted his army victory. Yes, indeed, God has destroyed the rule of the Magians, which is the Zoroastrian priests, and disunited them. They do not possess one single span of their territory that can bring harm to a Muslim. Yes, indeed, God has made you heirs to their land, houses, wealth, and sons, in order to see how they behave. Yes, indeed, the distance between the garrison towns of Al-Kufa and Al-Basra and the border areas of Persia is now the same as that between you and the two towns in the past. Now that our armies have penetrated into this land, God brings his command to pass, fulfills his promise right through to the last. So apply yourselves, and he will carry out his agreement with you in full and fulfill his promise to you. Do not rebel, lest God substitute others for you. My only fear for this community is that it will be put in danger by you. And so that is the conquest of Khorasan. Sorry if I was a little bit scattered, because it is complicated and you have a lot of conflicting and strange reports. But that's essentially what took place. And an important thing to remember is that the armies that were sent over to Khorasan were quite large in number. So it's estimated that during the Khulafa Rashidun, eventually as much as 50,000 Arab soldiers settled in Khorasan. And Persia had already been depopulated by the plague. A lot of their fighting men were killed by the Muslims in battle. And so to this day, if you do a DNA test on a modern Iranian person, their DNA is about 50% Arab from the Arabian Peninsula. And that is because so many Arabs settled there. And what happened during the medieval period is that Iran became the center of Sunni scholarship. And the Persians became extremely good at Arabic because of this large influx of Arabs. And the Abbasid revolution that ended up overtaking the Umayyads, it all started in Khorasan with descendants of these original conquerors from Basra and Kufa. Right? And they went and took over the Umayyad dynasty, or caliphate, if you will. So it's important to know that aspect. You had the Ghaznavids, the Salajuqa, who came, later on, and during Imam Ghazali's time. And it's just Khorasan is a very important region to be familiar with. Know about Jorjan, Tus, Nisabur, and Marv, Balkh, all these types of places, Bukhara, Samarkand. It's all very important, places in Islamic history, and it became the center of Hanafism during the medieval period. Many of the Hanafi books that are still used today for the Hanafi madhab emerged from the scholarship of Khorasan. So they became, even to this day, you have a lot of Sunni Muslims actually in Iran. I think the population there is 30% Sunni, and they still to this day write and produce some of the top, scholarship in the Sunni world in various languages, not only Arabic. So it's important history to know. This is a very long lecture, so with all of that, I will conclude. I ask that Allah give us beneficial knowledge, Ameen, and that He give us the energy to study more and more, to understand this deen, to understand who is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to increase our love for the Prophet and the Sahaba, Ameen. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuhu.